Hi everybody, Mike from the Digital Media Lab here today with part 5 of our video series creating a composite image. We're going to start blending some of our objects better together and creating some effects and things like that. Let's go ahead and get started. If you still have some of those old documents open, you can go ahead and close them. You can save them if you wish, but we already have them in our current layers, so there's not much need. So I went ahead and did that. Go ahead and select the flower layer that you have here. For me, it's called layer 2. And make sure that that is the active layer. And then I'm going to go to the bottom of my layers panel and I'm going to select pattern. And the reason for this is because our flower is looking too much like it belongs on this planet. So I want to go ahead and make it look a little bit otherworldly. And we're going to start by looking through some of these patterns that we have available to us. I'm going to apply this pattern to the flower itself. I'm going to clip it to it just like we did with some of our other adjustment layers. Let's see, I think water is going to work, but feel free, we can always change our minds later on. That's the beauty of adjustment layers and masking. We can always change our mind later on. I'll go ahead and just select this. This is looking pretty good. I'll go ahead and maybe, let's try scaling it up just a little bit to kind of give it kind of this other look. And I'll press OK. And just like we did with before with some of our other layers, we need to make sure that this layer kind of clips to the layer beneath it. What we can do, and I'm going to do it a slightly different way this time, I'm going to hold down the Alt key. If I hold down the Alt key on my keyboard and I mouse between those two layers, you'll notice that my mouse cursor changes. And that icon is the create a clipping layer. So I'll click that and that clips that to the layer beneath it. And if I zoom in on my flower, I'm using Alt and my mouse wheel, we'll notice that it's kind of overlaid the pattern a little bit too much. So what we can do here is we can change the blend mode to something different. So we could try multiply. By the way, your go-to blend modes are multiply, screen, overlight, soft light. Those are pretty much the blend modes that you're going to use most often. In this case, let's see, what does multiply do? That's kind of starting to make it look a little bit otherworldly. Let's go and stick with multiply. You can try whichever one you like. I like how that's looking. And then it's looking a little bit, again, it's kind of still looking sort of weird. So let's go ahead and give it a hue saturation layer, and we can start to kind of play with the colors like so. All right, once again, I need to clip this layer to the layer beneath it so we can kind of create that effect like there. There we go. Now we have a flower that looks kind of like it belongs on a different planet. Again, adjust the hue saturation to taste. Maybe we'll kind of go with a green and red. That looks interesting enough. Good enough. Let's go ahead and shift click all of those layers just as we did with the moon. This time I'm going to press Control G to kind of group those together. It creates the same effect of creating a folder, or you could click this group icon here at the bottom and we'll rename this flower. And let's move on to our next object. Now, any object sitting on another object needs to create a bit of a shadow. So we're going to need to kind of recreate that shadow. Now, we could go into our effects and try to do a drop shadow, but it's really not going to create the effect that we want. So just to kind of illustrate that point here, it's really not going to create, like it's going to like double down here. If I kind of increase some of these settings a little bit, let's increase the opacity so you guys can see what I mean. It's going to kind of like, it's not going to create the effect we want. So let's create our own drop shadow. So let's grab the add a layer icon at the bottom of our layers panel. We'll create a new blank layer, and then I'm going to drag it beneath the camera. All right, and then if I grab my brush tool, and let's see, let's make sure that our brush tool is set back to default. So I'll right click it and select reset tool. All right, I'll use my bracket keys to increase the size of my brush. I'm going to paint underneath the camera here and create a drop shadow. So I'm going to press the D key to set my colors back to the default settings, which is a foreground of black. So with a black foreground and my brush tool selected, I'm going to go ahead and just paint a little bit of black underneath here. Make sure you have a nice soft brush, which it should be as a default. So I'm just going to kind of paint a little bit under there. Now shadows always have two tiers to them, right? They always kind of have like an inner shadow and then an outer shadow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create even a bigger brush, and then I'm going to lower my opacity settings. Let's try, I'm going to lower it to about, let's try 30%. Oops, not 3%, 30%. So I'm going to type 30%. And then I'm going to paint the next layer of the shadow, which is just going to kind of grow out like that. All right, and then we have the beginnings of our shadow. Now inside of here, we've kind of gone a little bit too far with our shadow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my eraser tool, and we're just going to erase any little bits on the edge here that we don't want, because the shadow would only really be cast on the rock itself. It would not be cast on the grass. All right, so we can eliminate that little bit. Now our shadow is looking a little bit too heavy. So what we can do is we can go back to the layer and we can reduce its opacity a little bit and adjust this to taste. We could even grab our move tool and move this shadow around a little bit until we get something that looks a little bit like it's resting on there. So I'm going to adjust my camera up a little bit, make adjustments as you see fit to kind of try and make this look realistic. Another thing is that our camera, it doesn't look like it belongs with the scene. So what we can do is we can start to adjust its contrast and brightness so that it makes it look like it belongs with the scene a little bit. So I'll select layer 3, and I'm going to create a new brightness and contrast adjustment layer. And we're going to clip it, so I'll hold down Alt and clip it to layer 3 because I only want it to select this layer. And we can start to play with our brightness, our adjustment values so that it looks like it belongs with this scene. The scene's a little bit more brighter and has a little bit less contrast than our background. And we can make any adjustment necessary to kind of adjust that shadow down a little bit. Maybe I move it a little bit closer to the camera. Maybe I need to grab my eraser tool and re-erase some of that part right there. Make adjustments as you kind of see fit. All right, that's looking pretty good for our purposes here today. It'll blend in when we add some color adjustments here in a second. The next thing we need to do is our clouds, again, looking a little bit too earthly, so let's select the layer that contains our clouds as well as the background, and we're going to create a hue saturation adjustment layer. And we're going to go ahead and just grab your hue, and we can change our minds later, and we're going to crank that all the way up. Now, when I do that, let's crank it all the way up to the other, let's see, yeah, okay. When I do that, I end up affecting, oh, I almost forgot. We need to clip the hue saturation layer because we don't want to affect the moon. We don't want to affect the background there, so we're going to clip it to that layer so that it only affects that. Now this is it's affecting too many things because really I just want to adjust the way that the clouds look, not everything else. We have a layer mask with this, so we can layer mask out the bottom of this. And if you were to take a good guess as to which selection tool, we already talked about it, that likes a nice hard edge, like the horizon here, it's going to be our quick selection tool. So if I go to my quick selection tool, I'll drag this out until, again, I'll paint in and I'll drag out a selection so that it grabs all of that bottom part. Very good. And if it grabs too much, I can always just Alt click once again, and we'll just kind of Alt click in here until it gets what I want. Sometimes you may need to shrink your brush down. I'll use my bracket keys to shrink my brush down, and we'll just kind of click in there until it grabs the parts that I want. So we'll kind of inspect our edge. It should knock that out pretty darn well for most of you. Your results may vary, but again, you just kind of add and subtract to the selection. Now we need to make sure that we grab the rest of it, so I'm just going to grab, I could just continue on here, but I do want to show you another tool that we can use. We could use our Lasso Tool to just kind of quickly grab the bottom of this. And I want to add to my selection, so I'll hold down the Shift key, and if I click and drag, and I can click and drag outside of the edge of my document, so take a close look at what I'm doing. I can drag outside of my document, and then I can drag on the inside of here, and that grabs the rest of my selection. So usually you can use more than one selection tool to build your selections. And the Lasso Tool is great for just kind of quickly grabbing huge swaths of items like that. Now, with that selected, I need to make sure that the layer mask is selected of your hue saturation layer. I need to fill this with black. So I'm going to right click it, select fill, and then I'm going to change my fill color to black. And there we go. If I press Control D, we can see here that it's got that pretty well. It's doing a pretty good job, but I wonder if we couldn't get this selection to be a little bit better, so we can apply a select and mask. All right, and we're back after just Photoshop decided to crash on me, but let's continue on. So we're going to crank up our radius value here, and that's going to tighten up that edge a little bit. It does create like a little bit of a halo over here. That's okay. We're also going to crank up our smooth value, which is going to help smooth out the lines of this, because the horizon, again, should look realistic, not too jagged. And sometimes the quick selection tool, by the way, will create those very jagged selections very often here. Now feather is the next option, and this is an option if you're going to use this a lot if your image is out of focus. Okay, if you have anything that's, I don't recommend trying to select things too often, as it's a little bit challenging if they're out of focus, but if you do, you're going to end up feathering that selection a little bit here. Our image is in complete focus, so we don't need to use feather. And then contrast is kind of like the opposite of feather and will help tighten that selection in a little bit there. All right, those settings are looking pretty good here. Let's click OK so that we can apply those settings. And let's zoom in here. If I undo and I redo, you'll really see some very small changes in the selection, and that's looking pretty good there. So we now can control the hue saturation of just our sky. Let's make them a nice purple. Maybe we adjust our saturation up a little bit and really make that sky look nice and purple and otherworldly. I think it contrasts well with their green moon. And you can adjust this to however you like. And then we need to start looking at the ground layer, because the purple sky and the blue of the background, it's not really meshing very well. So let's take a look at creating another hue saturation adjustment layer. And this time, and I'm going to clip it to the layer just as before, so we're going to have multiple hue saturation layers, each kind of grabbing a different thing. And I want to grab just this mountainous area down here. So let's kind of take a look at that. And as I do this, you're going to notice that, again, the quick selection tool likes nice, sharp edges. And you'll notice that some of these edges aren't that sharp anymore, and you're going to end up fighting this tool a little bit. All right, so you're going to end up subtracting, so I'm going to hold down the Alt key and subtract from my selection, and then you're going to end up adding to your selection. Don't worry too much about some of these bushes. We're going to come back in and clean them up. All right, and like so. All right, so some of the edges is going to nail pretty good. I'm not really we're going to clean up this part of the image right here later on, so just kind of grab a good selection here. This edge that I'm kind of pointing to isn't terribly important. And again, some of these bushes, let's see, I want to make sure that some of these bushes are deselected, so I'm going to Alt drag some of these bushes over here so that it doesn't grab those. All right. As long as it kind of roughly gets that, we're doing pretty well. And with that selection active, I'm going to fill it with black, just as I did before. And boom, there. Let's go ahead and adjust our hue saturation layer so that we can see what it's doing. And we'll see that it's doing the opposite of what we want. So I'm going to press Control D to deselect, make sure I don't have an active selection. And I'm going to grab my mask, and once again, we're going to invert our mask. Aha. Now we have the background selected and not the foreground. So I can adjust the hue so that it matches my sky a little bit. So depending on what you adjusted your sky to, now I can adjust that hue a little bit. And in this case, maybe adjusting the lightness a little bit will work as well. And even though we didn't select our bushes very well, the edge isn't really looking too bad. As long as you don't, the nice thing about using hue saturation when you change colors, the human eye just simply isn't that sensitive to color. We're a lot more sensitive to luminance when it comes to those kinds of changes. So there you go. All right. And the next thing we want to do is that if let's go ahead and I'm just gonna, you can just take a look at my screen for a second. If I start to over adjust my settings here, we can notice that we're kind of affecting things in kind of a weird way. What I'd like to do is make some adjustments to this layer mask. Now I could grab my brush tool and with let's see, let's make sure our opacity is fairly high. With my brush tool, I could go in here and try to like manually kind of sort of do this, but there is a better way. So I'm going to undo that. Let's grab our gradient tool. I'm going to use the hotkey of G on my keyboard. So just the letter G on your keyboard will grab your gradient tool, or you can select it in two panels here. I'm going to reset the tool to make sure it's at the default settings. And by default, it's going to have a black to white gradient. Now I'm going to alt-click my layer mask. So if you ever want to view your layer mask, if you alt-click it, you can view that layer mask. If I alt-click it and I drag out a gradient, notice what it does is it can completely overrides the mask that I had by doing that. I'm going to press Control-Z. So what I can do is I can switch to a different kind of gradient, which is foreground to transparent. So which will be the second one on the list here. So if I go up to my gradient panel, and the second one on the list is foreground to transparent. All right, and you'll notice that if I click and drag here, it drags out and it recreates, it kind of smooths out some of those problems. I'm going to press undo twice to kind of undo those two gradients because I want to make sure that I'm looking at my image when I do this. So I'm going to click the thumbnail for the layer rather than the layer mask. So if I click my thumbnail, there we go. And then I'm going to immediately click back into my layer mask to make sure that it's selected. And then I'm going to click and drag out a new gradient. And if you need to do this more than once, that's okay. There we go. And then now we've kind of smoothed out the transition so that it looks like it's kind of happening out to the edge. I'm going to go ahead and change my hue saturation settings back to something that looks a little bit more normal. Well, normal for our planet here. Now we need to do some other adjustments to this to make it look like a planet. So let's kind of, let's add a solid color adjustment layer. And this time we're going to adjust everything in turn. And I'm going to pick a nice orange color here. We're going to change that to overlay. And overlay, let's try soft light. That'll kind of soften that up a little bit. It's a little bit too strong, so I'm going to reduce the opacity, and we're just going to kind of give it a little bit of orange hue so that it's not looking too much like Earth. All right, that's looking pretty good. And again, adjust these things to taste. I'd also kind of like to tighten up my image a little bit here, so I'm going to add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer and just increase the contrast a little bit. That's looking pretty good. And as we increase the contrast, it's also going to increase the saturation a little bit. And brightness is looking pretty good, so I'm going to leave that at 0. All right, the next thing that we need to do is we're going to create the border of our image. So inside of Photoshop, it does allow you to create vector shapes. I can grab my pen tool and I can draw out vector shapes. However, working with vectors inside of Photoshop can be problematic, especially as long as you, I mean, it's okay if you're using kind of basic shapes, circles and squares, it does okay. But if you want to do any kind of real shape building, you're going to need to go back to Illustrator. So let's do that now. Go ahead and open up Illustrator and pause the video if you need to. I'm going to create a new document. Now the size of this document isn't too terribly important as long as I kind of create a document that's roughly the right size. So I just want a document that's fairly tall and not too wide. So I'm going to just go to print and we'll select tabloid. I know that tabloid's nice and tall. I'll go ahead and just select the inches, although that's not really going to matter. And we'll select create. All right, and I have my board here. And we're going to build the shape that we're going to mask out our document with. So I'm going to start with an ellipse tool. You can build out your shape however you would like it to do. And what I'm going to do is, if you remember the Pathfinder tools, I'm going to use those to kind of build a shape. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and we'll kind of drag out a rectangle here. I might drag out another rectangle and maybe we can rotate it like so. And just kind of drag right here. The stroke and the fill aren't too terribly important. I'll hold down the Alt key and I'll drag that rectangle down here, so that maybe we can get some of the shape down here. All right, once I'm satisfied with my shape, I'm going to grab the entire shape. Let's see, let's make sure it's all on the artboard, and then I'm simply going to select Unite. Now, one of the things that I would like in my shape is a place for the text. So I can grab my rectangle tool, and again, we can kind of build this shape out like so. And then if I have both objects selected, once again, I'll just click and drag both selections. All of this is back when we did this in Illustrator. And I will click minus front, which will remove that shape here. So we can build our shapes much faster in Illustrator. Another thing that I'd really like to do, I'd kind of like to shore up this shape right here. So I can always just drag another rectangle on top of there, and let's drag that, and we can unite that back into our shape. Oops, I didn't quite get it quite right. So again, that's the beauty of vectors, is that we can always change our mind. All right, that's looking fine. That's not really going to matter. All right, once you're satisfied with your shapes, once you've used Pathfinder kind of build some kind of shape out that you know that's going to create a nice window sort of composition, what you're going to do is you're going to go to Edit Copy, and you're going to copy that shape. And we're going to go back to Photoshop, and inside of your Paths panel, so make sure that your Paths panel is active. If you don't see your Paths panel, you can simply go up to Window, Paths. You're going to create a new blank path. So you click at the bottom of the Paths panel, you'll see the new icon, and you're going to paste that path into here. That'll bring up the Options dialog box. Now, sometimes you want to create a smart object. In our case, we actually want the path itself. All right, and that should paste the path into the Paths panel itself. Once we have it here, if I grab my Move tool, I can reposition, I need to grab my black arrow tool, not the Move tool, and I can reposition it wherever I'd like. So make sure that wherever it is, we can see all of the things that we dropped out. You can right-click the path and then select Free Transform Path, and you can scale it up. And because it is a vector object, and because we're kind of using it as a mask, you're free to stretch this. So if I hold down the Shift key, it will let me stretch this in different directions. So I want to kind of make sure that it doesn't need to touch the very edge of the document. We want to leave some kind of border around there, but I do want to kind of contort my object a little bit so that it does make sense with my document. So if I stretch things out, it's perfectly okay. Once I'm satisfied with that, I'm going to press Return. And if I go back to my Layers panel, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to make sure that all of my layers are selected. So I'm going to begin at the very first layer, and then I'm going to scroll down and then I'm going to Shift click and make sure all of my layers are selected. I'm going to group everything together. So everything I have is inside of a single layer. Now, groups themselves can contain layer masks. So if I click Layer Mask once, what it will do is it will create a pixel-based mask. Every layer, or in this case group, can have two masks. The first one is a pixel-based mask, and the second one is a vector-based mask. So if I click the Add a Layer Mask icon a second time, and as long as that path is active, as long as you see that blue line, it will create that object. I'll go ahead and click off of it to kind of remove that blue line that you see there, and I have my object. If you need to do any repositioning, you can reposition the mask using the path selection tool, and you can adjust the position of the mask. If you need to transform it, again, you can just right click it and select Free Transform. I'll go ahead and grab my Move tool, and with the layer selected, I can move the entire thing like that if we need to reposition like that. Now, my background right now, we can see here that Photoshop is telling us that it is transparent. That's not quite what we want, so I'm going to grab a solid color adjustment layer, and let's grab a nice blue. We can always change our minds later on if we want. And then I need to make sure that that color fill layer goes beneath my object there. My blue is looking a little bit too bright. I kind of want something a little bit darker, so I'll darken that blue down just a little bit. Again, pick whichever color you like. I'm just kind of grabbing some colors. And then the last and final thing we need to do is add a little bit of text to our layer. So I'll click and drag out a text box, pressing T, by the way, to grab my text tool. And I'll go ahead and add my copy, which is Mike is out of this world cool. I'll press Control A to select the entire bit of copy, and then in my properties box, and I'll click and drag this down here, we can adjust the size of our copy and things like that. So let's try something like, for me, 66 is working. That looks fine. And let's see, by default, the leading should be set to auto. I'm going to go ahead and adjust that down just a little bit. So I'm just using my, so if you select any box inside of Photoshop, I'm just using my up and down arrows, by the way, to kind of shrink that text down a little bit. Right now the text is black, and I think it's going to work a little bit better if I make it purple. Let's try a nice purple color to kind of, and I'll click OK. And there we go. Now maybe some minor adjustments so that it's not bumped up right up against that edge. And there we go. All right, once we have our text in place and we've made some minor adjustments to it, then we're just about done. There is one last step that we need to do, and this is not something you would normally do inside of Photoshop. It's just something that we need to do in order to turn in this project, because right now if we go to File, Save, and I want to save on my computer, and I'll just save it to my desktop. Let's go ahead and create a version for you guys to turn in. Right now, the current version is a bit big. It's going to be over 100 megs. That's going to be a bit big to kind of transfer over networks. So let's make a smaller version of this file so that it's a little bit easier to turn in. What you're going to do is go to Image, Duplicate, and we're going to create a duplicate of this image. When we duplicate this image, we can go ahead and rename it. So let's name it our file convention, which is digm 1350 underscore, and your last name, in my case, Dawson, and your first initial, in my case, Mike. So make sure that you put your last name and your first initial there, and there you go. Once you're done with that, click OK, and you're inside of a copy of your original document. And now we can save, now we can make some changes to this. So I'm going to grab my crop tool, and by default it's started to ratio. I want to change that to width and height resolution, and we're going to change this to 4 inches by 9 inches, and we want to lower this the pixel count to 72. And I'm just pressing tab to go between the different dialog boxes. 4 inches by 9 inches is not the best size, so I'm going to do 4 by 6 actually. And make whatever adjustments you see are necessary to kind of make it fit within the crop. You can always crop a little bit bigger if you need to, but for me this is looking pretty good, and I'll double click it and that will commit that change. If I press Control 0, we can see here that our image is shrunk down. It is quite a bit lower resolution. We wanted to work with a higher resolution document so that it would be easier. The way that the selections work change in lower resolution documents. So best to work with high resolution documents and go for there. Now you have a version of your file that you can turn in, so make sure you save it and do so based on the instructor's preferences for turning in your work. All right, thank you guys very much. See you later.